Max Orr, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Nat Fyfe from the Fremantle Footy Club.
Trent Cotchin from the Richmond Footy Club.
Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Patrick Cooch from the Carlton Footy Club.
It's Rory Sloane here from the Adelaide Crows.
This is Tom Mitchell. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Jack Macrae, the Premiership Bulldog, is now a part of the St Kilda Football Club. For many years, he's been viewed as one of the most elite midfielders in the game. But at St Kilda, can he take himself back to that territory and get back to the top of the midfield mountain? While for the Western Bulldogs, is this a loss that unfortunately is just going to keep thinning out their depth and their best 22? And for AFL Fantasy, Supercoach, Dream Team and Keeper coaches, he's once been a big mega premium. Can he get back to Uber territories again for us in 2025? We're going to talk about all those things on today's player review as we look at the trade of Jack Macrae to the St Kilda Saints. It's MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you're well and I hope you've enjoyed this series so far. The good news is there's still plenty of off-season content coming for our Patreons for just a couple of dollars a month, with the details in the description of this episode. Every single week we're dropping a brand new episode looking at who both myself and fellow Coaches panelist Kane believe are the top 50 keeper league prospects. So if you play that form of draft or you just want some off-season fantasy footy content, join our Patreon and you'll get access to the first couple of episodes that are already out. Let's talk about Jackson Macrae. Spent a lot of time in the AFL already and has been one of those players that really from the get-go showed his elite traits. His ability to just run all day from contest to contest to contest is absolutely phenomenal. His second, third and fourth efforts to get the ball from either an uncontested possession with an uncontested mark or link up from transition and set up his team with that left foot that he's got inside forward 50 has been absolutely something I've loved watching over the better part of the last decade. He runs for days. He's committed. He's not just a one-dimensional outside player too. If you want to put him in at stoppage to win a clearance, he can do that. He's got no issues applying the defensive mindset and tackles too. So he's got some really nice dimensions about him as a midfielder, and it's why for a long period of time in the fantasy footy community, he was viewed as one of the safest premium midfielders we had going around. Such was his durability and his consistency of scoring. And then in a pure AFL sense, he was just such a ball magnet because his footy IQ was so high that it felt like wherever Jack was where the ball was about to go. And that's as much about understanding his team and the way they're trying to move the ball, as well as understanding the dynamic of the game. So a really sharp and smart AFL footballer. And I think let's talk about what that means from a St Kilda perspective. This midfield is led brilliantly and valiantly by Jack Steele. He is not just the prototype modern-day midfielder. He's probably the prototype player that you'd want to play alongside. Has no problems cracking in and winning the contest. If there's something that needs to be done to negate a player through a tackle or a defensive asset pressure, he will go and do that as well. Really nice overhead mark, has worked on the athletic components of his game and built up his aerobic capacities to now. Jack's got the ability to get uncontested possessions and marks around the ground and not just be a coalface style midfielder. St Kilda have really lacked some support for Jack. Brad Crouch for a period of time was that, but was a similar style of player to Jack, but lacked the defensive element, but had the ball-winning component. At time of recording, and even as recently in the past week or two, St Kilda have come out and said they are still confident that Brad is going to play some football for them in 2025 and beyond. But certainly it doesn't seem confident that this degenerative knee issue that he has is going to impact that. The reason I talk about these two guys before we look at what it means for Macrae supporting Steele in this midfield is it's Philippou, who's had a handful of games through there. He's looked very, very good, but a handful of games through there. Again, tall, contested style midfielder, can take a really nice overhead mark and has got some good running patterns. But then it's a little bit of an odds and ends of players that roll through there. Dow has had his opportunities. Zach Jones, when he's got fit, has had his opportunities. I know they threw Jack Sinclair there in the back half of the year, but I'm still convinced they want him half mid, half back, and not just a full-time midfielder. Hunter Clark's not really come on in the way that they hoped. They do have a nice draft hand at the moment, and given it's a midfield favourable draft, they should be able to jag some talent to add through there. But that's the appeal of Jack Macrae, is he gives some now support for Steele. He gives some now leadership alongside Steele in that midfield, while Philippou and these young mids that they hope to emerge come through. He just keeps them competitive. Too harsh of a word, but he keeps St Kilda in the mix. Where does he play? Well, at the Bulldogs, he's been kind of on this wing half forward mix for a period of time. It wouldn't surprise me if they float him between a centre bounce midfielder and a wingman. They've got some really nice outside speed and runners, and Jack's not a fast player. But what he is he's got a high athletic and aerobic capacity that sees him just stay on the field and get to contest to contest to contest to contest. And so that's what he would bring to this side, is this always there, wherever the ball is or needs to be, Jackson will be there. So I think for St Kilda, if we're just looking for a short-term hit, this is a really handy move, as it helps protect the next generation of developing midfielders that they've got and those that they hope to pick up at the draft in just a few weeks' time.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like, to check you have the tickets in your wallet first before you drive 2 hours to the big game. Seriously, you had one job. Now the closest you'll get to the 50-yard line is parking lot D. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
For the Western Bulldogs, what does it mean for them? Well, they've kind of squeezed him out of the team. Now, I know he's played 18 games this year. 4 of them were as a starting sub. So he's been in and around the best team, but his role over the period of the past 3 years especially has drastically changed. Since 2021, we've seen his centre bounce function in this team, the Western Bulldogs, decrease. We've seen his midfield time across the wing decrease. It's why in fantasy footy he's picked up a dual position status as a mid-forward, because he spent time, and a significant amount of time, outside of this midfield, which is where Jackson does his best, is when he's either at centre bounce, at wing, or at half forward but pushing up. When he's in and around the ball, he is at his best. But the Bulldogs have, for a number of reasons, chosen not to place him in that position, which is why the trade request and ultimate trade has gone through, is because they, and he, Jackson specifically, wanted to play more in and around the ball through the midfield, and they, the Bulldogs, felt like they didn't need it. They've got a really tight midfield mix. Liberatore, Bontempelli, Treloar as the inside three. It's a very, very tight centre bounce rotation. And then players such as Bailey Williams roll through that wing position. They try to push their flankers up relatively highly. And then they've got some young star just waiting for midfield opportunity in a Riley Sanders, who is in and out of the side, but never really inside the midfield unit too much. So I don't think the Bulldogs feel like their best side is lacking too much. What it does do is it takes some significant experience, and that depth of their midfield unit is going to get tested. And it means guys like Gallagher, for example, and Garcia, who have spent some time up and around the ball, up and around the wings, up and around the flanks, just greater expectation has to sit on their shoulders. And if they've let Macrae go, which they have, they clearly think that these style of players can at least match what Macrae was doing in the role that they wanted him to play. So the Bulldogs, I think they're pretty content about it. It does hurt their depth a little bit should 1 or 2 injuries come through. It just means even greater responsibility on younger shoulders has to be taken. But players like Riley Sanders are probably crying out for that opportunity. So for the Bulldogs, I get it. I see it. I understand it. From a fantasy footy perspective, what does this mean for us? Well, 18 games this year, 4 of them sub-affected. There was a couple of decent scores through there, a 129 in fantasy and a 123 in Supercoach was his best score for the year. That 129 in fantasy was his one and only ton for the year. He had 3 in Supercoach and averaged in that low 70s across the format. What we've seen about Jackson Macrae over a number of years is this. One, a significant change in his midfield role, but where Jackson scores his best, it isn't as a stoppage player. He actually scores at his best from transition points rather than stoppage points. Right back at the start of this season, in the preseason of 2024, something we do here at the coaches panel is we spend the first 50 days of the year looking at one specific player. We call it the 50 most relevant. It's a subjective list that I have put together who I believe across Supercoach, AFL Fantasy are the most relevant players for us to talk about for that upcoming season. And the reason I bring that up is one, January 1, make sure you're listening out. We start that again for 2025. But in that preseason of 2024, myself and Jaden, who's a legend in the fantasy footy community, deep dived into the scoring trends of Jackson Macrae and pinpointed and highlighted where he needs to play and the game style he needs to sit into to ascend back to that 100-plus average across the formats, and where up until this point in time, it's just been a continual decline. And so we'll go, and I'm sure Jack will feature, especially if he has mid-forward status, which I think he does heading into 2025. He will feature again in the 2025 50 most relevant. But if you're like, oh, what is this stoppage and transition scoring that MJ is talking about? You can go back on the same platform that you're listening and watching this episode. You can go back and look for the Jackson Macrae episode. It talks in greater depth about the difference for Jack about scoring from stoppage and transition and how it impacts. I think if he's a part of this midfield mix at St Kilda and he's got forward status in our fantasy footy platform, wow, it's going to be a really big conversation to have, because there is 20 to 30 points per game of upside comfortably if he's back in and around the ball and used in the role that he was used in 2018, 19, 20, 20 sort of era where he was just the safest, most durable midfielder, captaincy option most weeks for us across the formats. If he's back in that opportunity at St Kilda, that could be interesting, because St Kilda last year, well, they were top 5 in AFL fantasy for total points and top 5 for possessions. And so they get a lot of ball and they kick it around and they use it well. If Jack's stepping into a system like that, this could get interesting. Just as a midfielder alone, let alone if my forecast forward eligibility maintains, man, this could be really interesting. At the very least, in your fantasy footy, you got to put him in your coaches panel notebook for the start of the season, because there's a lot of variables that need to shake out for him. But even if 1 or 2 of them land, he's going to be someone we're going to need to seriously consider in Classic, and could be super valuable on draft day and return a hugely significant investment, given there's going to be people on draft day that just see the average, know the burn factor of the last 2 years and walk away and not link all the elements together for Jack. For me, he's a fascinating player to look at, and we need to talk about him more heading into the preseason of 2025. Thank you so much if you're watching this on YouTube for tuning in. If you haven't given the video a like yet, make sure you do so. And comment below. Let me know, what do you think his average is going to be for 2025? And I'm really fascinated to get your take. If you're listening to this as an audio podcast, thanks so much for subscribing. And if you haven't already done so, give the channel a 5-star rating. If you want to get that Patreon series that I was talking about, our keeper ranks, all the details for that, to get in touch with us across social media, and to get your hands on some brand new Coaches Panel merch, where you can find those in the details in the description of this episode. Thanks so much for tuning in. We can't wait to be back chatting with you again about another player that's moved clubs this AFL trade and free agency period.